There are certain facts of history that no one can deny. These facts of history are recorded for us in books and in other ways. People who actually saw certain events happen, who actually saw certain people live. For example, none of us here this morning ever met or saw George Washington. None of us. You may have met somebody named George Washington, but not the George Washington, first president of the United States. None of us here ever met or saw Abraham Lincoln, the president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. But we don't have any doubt that they existed. We all know that they lived when the history books tell us they lived, that they did the things the history books tell us that they did. Well, what about the resurrection? There were a lot of people who testified that they saw Jesus after he was raised from the dead. These same people who testified were forced to pay very, very dearly for their testimony. In fact, in some cases, they paid with their lives for their testimony that they saw Jesus raised from the dead. Such facts as these actually support the actual resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Yet from the beginning, though, there have been alternative theories to explain the empty tomb. Something that's very key and very important that you need to understand, though. The tomb was empty. Okay? And in fact, in these theories that we're going to look at, none of them say that the tomb was still occupied. Because you see, if the tomb was still occupied, this Christianity thing would have had a very short and abrupt lifespan. But it wasn't occupied. It was empty. In fact, this morning I was looking at Yahoo, and one of the news stories had to do with Christians still believe the almost impossible to believe story of the resurrection. This is a Fox News story. I was like, what are y'all talking about? But anyway, I expect it from other sources, not necessarily Fox. But anyway, but the point is, are there other alternatives out there? And what are those alternatives? And do they make more sense than believing that God raised Jesus from the dead? Because of Matthew records for us the earliest theory. The earliest theory is that the disciples stole the body. It's recorded for us in Matthew chapter 28. If you want to open up your Bibles to Matthew 28, we'll be reading from there shortly. And there have been other theories that have been raised as well. Because of the significance of the resurrection, those who are opposed to the gospel know that this event must be discredited. And it must be discredited at any and all costs. And in some instances, that cost is their own willingness to use logic to think through things. We who believe in the resurrection must always be ready to provide a defense. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. What I want to do this morning is help you be able to provide that answer. Help you be able to provide an answer when somebody says, the resurrection, that is just so hard to believe. You'll be able to say, well, the man's come up with some other theories, but they're even harder to believe. And be able to know why. Not only why we accept the testimony of the witnesses, and in the past we've talked about how we determine if somebody is credible or discreditable as a witness, but also why we find alternative explanations impossible to accept. In this study, we're going to consider various alternatives to the resurrection and why they are inadequate to explain the empty tomb. And again, the tomb was empty. There can be no dispute to that. And in fact, most of these, except for one of them, makes a different claim. But that is easy to disprove. But anyway, most of them acknowledge that the tomb was empty. So really, the question that we're after, the question we want to answer is, what happened to the body? That's what we want to know. And the first explanation is the oldest, and that is that the disciples stole the body. The elements of this theory, very simple. The disciples stole the body and then claimed that he rose from the dead. And in fact, this was the quote-unquote official explanation for a long time. In fact, if you look at Matthew chapter 28, at the beginning of the chapter, an angel appears. Look at verse 4. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. Very important. They shook and became like dead men. Okay? Now, if we move down to verse 11 through verse 15, we read these words. While the women were on their way, Jesus has commissioned them to go and tell his disciples. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city after they recovered from their shock, I guess, went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised the plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets back to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Sounds like a plan. But there are some problems with this theory. The biggest problem is that this particular explanation of the empty tomb defies logic. Okay? You have to suspend common sense to believe this particular theory. For example, if the soldiers were asleep, as they claim to have been, I guess they were asleep because when the angel appeared, they passed out, but fainted or whatever. But if they were asleep, how do they know who came and took the body? Anyone here ever sleep with their eyes open and fully aware of everything that's going on around you, yet you're still asleep? No. If you sleep, you close your eyes and you sleep. And if you're asleep, you don't know who's coming and who's going. And yet somehow, while they were asleep, the disciples came and took the body. And none of them, when they were asleep, if they happened to have stirred a little bit, they saw the disciples taking the body and didn't do anything about it. How does that work? I mean, and think about this, how could this large stone used to seal the mouth of the tomb, not just rolled in front of it, but a little trench dug in the entryway so that the stone would sit down in it so that it would sort of lock the tomb without any possible way of, there was a possible way of getting it out, but it would take a lot of effort. There was a Roman seal put on the tomb. All this other stuff, these other things used to get the stone to not move. How were the disciples, a group of men, going to get that stone rolled away without waking up the guards? I mean, you get 2 or 3 guys together, going to try and lift something heavy, there's going to be noise made, okay? Right? I mean, there's going to be some grunting, right? There's going to be, somebody's going to step on a twig. Somebody's going to step on a sharp rock and say, ouch, or something to that. Something's going to happen that would have woken the soldiers up. Excuse me. So it defies logic. And besides, the soldiers guarding the tomb were Romans. This means something very important. If you look back at Matthew 27, 62 through 66, Pilate commissions this guard. Now, granted, these soldiers may have thought they were being punished, okay? Because they're told to guard a tomb. Really? A tomb of a peasant Galilean rabbi? What? But they were guarding the tomb. They were Romans. They were professional soldiers. Professional soldiers follow orders, especially Roman soldiers. See, they were charged with guarding the tomb with their very lives. And here's the thing, if something happened to that which they were guarding, in this case the body of Jesus, you know what was going to happen next? They were going to join the body in the tomb because they were going to be killed. That's why the rulers of the Jews said, if the report gets to the governor, we'll satisfy him, keep you out of trouble. Those guards had to be very trusting of those Jewish leaders because they were going to be in a lot of trouble. It was going to take a lot. Not only that, the idea that they fell asleep while on duty. I mean, really? The purpose of the soldiers being there in the first place was to prevent this from happening. And yet they were unable to prevent this from happening, at least if we believe this particular theory. But not only that, this would make those who testified that they saw Jesus liars and frauds. Their testimony, though, as we have seen from past lessons and all, is unimpeachable. Suppose that just a few of the disciples were engaged in stealing the body of Jesus. Say Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, a couple of others maybe. They came and they somehow managed to escape the guard's notice, move that huge heavy boulder, and take the body of Jesus. Others still say that they saw Jesus, that they ate and they drank with Jesus after his resurrection. And you still have to explain why they were willing to lie and die for the lie, knowing that the lie was a lie. I've had a little experience in this when I was growing up. This whole telling a lie and then getting caught. And then you have to tell another lie to cover the other lie, and then another lie to cover that other. Eventually it gets to the point where you just have to say, hey, I lied. Right? Okay, I'm not alone, right? Anyone else here have any experience with lying? You always get caught, and it's never a pleasant thing. Well, the likelihood of timid disciples stealing the body of Jesus right out from under the noses of highly trained, highly disciplined, and highly skilled Roman soldiers while they slept on duty, an offense punishable by death, is hard to believe, really. Perhaps that's why those who refused to believe in the resurrection felt the need to come up with some other alternative explanations, such as they went to the wrong tomb. Okay, the elements of this theory is that the women went to the wrong tomb and they found it empty, and so they erroneously concluded that Jesus had risen, and their story spread. Now, there are some problems with this theory. Number one, the women had been to the tomb before. Matthew chapter 27, verse 61 tells us they were there when Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea put Jesus in the tomb. They were there. They saw where it was. Excuse me. Also, in John chapter 20, Mary goes to tell Peter and John and the other apostles about the resurrection. And what happens? Peter and John take off running for the tomb. John outruns Peter, gets there first. Peter comes in a close second maybe, or a distant second, who knows? And then Mary comes along. And you know what? They all show up at the same place. What is the likelihood of 3 people remembering the same place if it was the wrong place? Doesn't make much sense. I mean, and besides, you got to think that if, Peter and John are racing to the tomb and John runs ahead of Peter, I mean, what I know about Peter, he wouldn't have been too shy about saying, "Hey, John, the tomb's over here, dummy." But he didn't. The likelihood that they would all show up at the same wrong place is unimaginable. Besides that, I mean, if you think about it, the religious and political leaders could have very easily silenced the apostles. You want to know how? If they had gone to the wrong tomb, all the religious leaders had to do is say, no, his tomb's over here, and let's move the stone. And look, there's his body. Ta-da! No Christianity. But it didn't work that way. You know why? Because they weren't at the wrong tomb. They were at the right tomb. And at the right tomb is where it was empty. There was no one there. So you still have also the testimony of the apostles to contend with. A more popular explanation, because these first 2 are completely unimaginable, a more popular one is, in some circles, is simply that Jesus swooned and later revived. The elements of this theory are that Jesus did not actually die on the cross, that he only swooned, that he was suffering from shock and pain and loss of blood. He simply fainted or swooned on the cross from exhaustion. And that these untrained, unskilled Roman soldiers who were overseeing the crucifixion thought that he was dead. He looked like it, so he must be dead. So they took him down off the cross. He was buried, and in the coolness of the tomb, he revived. And then he got out and appeared to his disciples and lived in obscurity until he actually did die years later. Some problems with this theory, okay? Number 1, Jesus would have had to have sufficiently revived in the tomb to break through the burial garments, and not just the cloths that were wrapped around his body, but the 75 to 100 pounds of spices that were used to embalm him. He would have had to somehow successfully break free from all of those things. Okay? And as I understand it, with that his burial garments were in the tomb empty, but still with the form of a body, he would have somehow had to fix that so that it looked like there was still a body in there, but there wasn't. Fold up the face cloth that was over his face after he got out of his arms being tied and everything, and fix the face cloth, lay it separate. He would have to roll away the large stone that sealed the tomb somehow, or get out of the tomb somehow, no one knows. And he did all of this, by the way, in total darkness, okay? Remember, stone in front of the cave, dark cave, total blackness. Once he gets out of the tomb, he's got those pesky Roman soldiers to deal with. Armed Roman soldiers. Okay? And then if he gets past them, or once he gets past them, he has to walk 7 miles to Emmaus, where he is seen by 2 disciples. And then, after they take off running back to Jerusalem, he has to walk 7 miles back to Jerusalem, where he was seen by the apostles. And he did all this in the same day. Now, another reason why this can't have happened this way. Every effort was made to prove that he was dead. The Roman soldiers at the cross pierced his side, John 19 tells us, out of which flowed blood and water. Medical people tell us the reason blood and water flowed out of his side is that blood flowed and then he ran out of blood. Every drop of his blood had been spilled. And then the water came out as a result of that, an indication that he was already dead. Perhaps already dead of what other medical science people tell us from crucifixion and what they understand of it, dead of a ruptured heart. Again, his heart was ruptured in possibility, yet in 3 days it so repaired itself that it could fill his body again with blood, even though there were holes in his body where the blood would have maybe just kept coming out. And it would fill his body with enough blood to give him the energy to break through the burial garments, move the stone, fight off the guards, walk 14 miles. You know, these soldiers weren't just fly-by-night people. You know, in the Roman army, they had people who were in charge of certain aspects of keeping peace in the kingdom. These guys, their job was execution. It was what they did. They were professionals. They were meticulous about it. They knew whether a person was still alive or still dead. Besides, if they messed up, there was a penalty for that. They themselves would be executed. So they had every reason to make absolutely certain that Jesus was dead before his body was taken off the cross. Pilate made sure that he was dead. Mark 15 tells us, when Joseph of Arimathea wanted the body, Pilate asked for the centurion to come in and check and make sure that he was dead. Not only would this make the apostles liars and frauds, but also Jesus for allowing a lie to spread for years and years and decades and centuries and millennium after that. Another popular alternative explanation is that the disciples experienced hallucinations or visions. Now, the elements of this theory is that all of Christ's post-resurrection appearances were only supposed appearances. That those who claimed to see Jesus actually had hallucinations. They had visions. Now, some problems with this. Number one, remember that the appearances were not just to individuals one at a time. They were to two disciples on the road to Emmaus. They were to groups of people. The 10 apostles claimed to see him, John 20. He appeared, 1 Corinthians 15:6 tells us, to a group of over 500 people at one time. The hallucination theory contradicts laws and principles which psychiatrists say are essential to hallucinations. 3 in particular. Number 1, only certain kinds of people have hallucinations. These are usually high-strung, highly imaginative, and very nervous people. Usually only paranoid and schizophrenic individuals have hallucinations, and the appearances were not restricted to people of any particular psychological makeup. So therefore, because it wasn't just one type of person that had these hallucinations, it couldn't have happened. Second, hallucinations are linked to an individual's subconscious. An individual may have a hallucination, but a group of individuals cannot have a hallucination together. Okay? It just doesn't work that way. And third, they occur in people where there's a spirit of anticipation or hopeful expectation. The disciples did not have that hope or anticipation. You might say, wait a second. Jesus had said he was going to rise from the dead 3 days later. Yeah, but let's turn over to Luke chapter 24. Verses 19 through 21. Jesus is talking to some followers on the way to Emmaus. He says, and one of them says, "Are you only a visitor? You don't know what's going on here in Jerusalem?" And Jesus says, "What things?" "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him." Listen though to verse 21. "But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." We had hoped. Does that sound like they're living in hopeful anticipation of his resurrection? It sounds like they were lost. It sounds like they had no clue. They weren't living in hopeful anticipation. They were prone to disbelieve even after they were told about the resurrection. Most notably Thomas in John chapter 20. But he wasn't alone. Plus, if these post-resurrection appearances were just hallucinations and visions, we ask that same question. What happened to the body? Okay, if they just saw hallucinations, where's the physical body? Then there is the theory that someone impersonated Jesus. What this theory says is the appearances were not really Christ at all, but someone impersonating him, able to pull off the most clever hoax in all of time, all of history. This is evident because in some instances they didn't recognize him at first. Now, problems with this theory. Number one, the disciples were reluctant to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead anyway. Some were doubtful, such as Thomas. It would have been hard to convince them unless it was really, truly him. It also would have been impossible to impersonate Christ's wounds. This actually was the way Christ proved himself to Thomas, John chapter 20. Now that the apostles traveled with Jesus for 3 years. When you hang around with somebody for 3 years, you get to know them, and you're not likely going to mistake somebody else for them. Also, the one claiming to be Jesus performed miracles. No one could do that, such as suddenly appearing in locked rooms, John 20, verse 19. Directing them how to catch fish, John 21, 1 through 7. Closely related to this theory is that someone was mistaken for Jesus. Basically, this says that the disciples, they mistook someone for Jesus. It wasn't Jesus at all, but someone who looked like Jesus. For example, the women at the tomb, they mistook Jesus for the gardener in John 20, verse 14 and 15. This has the same problems as the impersonation theory, though, about how the disciples were reluctant to believe, couldn't recreate the wounds and everything. Ample time for Jesus to verify his identity. And true, while Mary may have mistaken Jesus for the gardener, she eventually was able to see through her grief and recognize him, know who he was. All of these are people who put forth by people who don't believe in the resurrection, who say the resurrection is impossible to have happened. But there is an alternative proposed by some theologians, believers, at least they claim to be believers, who just cannot accept the idea of a physical bodily resurrection, and that is that it was only a spiritual resurrection. The elements of this theory: Christ's resurrection was not a physical resurrection, or a real physical resurrection. Christ's body remained in the grave, and his resurrection was only spiritual in nature. It was only told as a physical resurrection to illustrate the truth of spiritual resurrection. Now, there are some problems with this theory, believe it or not. If it was only a spiritual resurrection, what happened to the body? Same question we've been asking. If his resurrection was not physical, where's the body? The enemies of Christ were never able to produce a body. Would have come in handy long about Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 5. If they could say, no, his body's right here, we've got it. They could have easily and gladly discredited the disciples. Again, the nature of the apostles' testimony is empirical. They ate and they drank with him. They touched him. If you look at Luke chapter 24, verses 36 through 43, Luke tells us these things. He says, while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled. They thought they saw a ghost. They thought it was a spiritual resurrection. Jesus, though, says, "Why are you troubled? Why do you doubt? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." And then he gets a piece of broiled fish and eats it in their presence. Paul argued a bodily resurrection of Jesus as evidence for our own bodily resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 12 through 58. The resurrection of Jesus has been variously interpreted as a great hoax. That is, the resurrection is false. It's also been interpreted as mythology. The resurrection is fiction. Therefore, various alternatives have been proposed to explain the empty tomb. But there's really only one interpretation that's worth accepting. That it is the supreme event of history. The resurrection is not false. The resurrection is not fiction. The resurrection is fact. Supported by the empirical testimony provided by reliable witnesses, with implications of great significance for both unbelievers and believers alike. When you consider the strength of the apostles' testimony, and you contrast it with the weakness of the alternative explanations that have been proposed, it leads an honest person really to only one direction, one conclusion: to faith in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Are you willing to believe in Jesus that you might have life in His name? Then listen to the words the Apostle Paul wrote and proclaimed the Apostle Peter proclaimed in the first gospel sermon. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this: God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. When the people heard this, they were cut to the heart and asked Peter and the other apostles, "Brothers, what shall we do?" Peter replied, "Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of sins, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. This promise is for you and your children and for all who are far off, for all whom the Lord our God will call." It's Acts 2, 36 through 39. Have you grabbed hold of that promise? Have you taken advantage of the fact that Jesus, because He loves you so much, He left heaven. He came to earth. He lived and He died on the cross for you. But 3 days later, He arose just for you, so that you can have hope of being resurrected to spend eternity with Him. If you haven't, now's a perfect opportunity for you to take advantage of that. Now's a perfect opportunity for you to put Him on in baptism. Maybe you've put Him on in baptism, but you've since sort of not been as faithful as you know you should. And if that's your situation, there's no time like the present to make things right between you and God. Maybe that's a silent prayer right where you're at. Maybe it involves a public response. Whatever that need is, don't leave here without taking care of that need. If we can help you through a public response to do so, won't you come to the front as we stand and sing together?